You're seeing coming together in the Middle East of a number of things. The first and most important, in my opinion, is the end of colonialism. That's bigger than the end of the United States because it's the end of the British and the French and the German. They all had empires, many of them with outposts in the Middle East. If you look at the history, France, Syria, Lebanon, Germany, Turkey, and other places, Britain everywhere, and then all of them wiped out in the Second World War heavily and replaced by the United States, which become. The others are still there, but replaced by the United States. So that area of the world is part of a revolution that really starts in the first half of the 20th century and then really takes off in the second half and continuing. And that is a rejection of being a colonial subordinate. Not finished, not by a long shot. One big struggle happened in the first half of the 20th century when they kind of got themselves together. The people there understood they're going to have a big fight to get out of this. Second half, they took the first big step, political independence. Now, in the 21st century, they're dealing with the economic independence, which they do not have, and they're bitter. Bitter because many of them didn't understand that political independence doesn't go. In other words, no necessary. You can be as dependent economically after independence as you were before. Political independence, parliamentary government is a bit of a mirage. They weren't leftist enough. If they had been more leftist, they would have understood that the corporations can buy the political system if they need to and want to, and that can render the government a shell. Puppets, sort of like we have here. The best example I can think of, if you look at a number of major issues that the Gallup or other polling companies regularly monitor, overwhelming majorities believe what the Congress does not do. Majority of people don't want the Ukraine war, don't want to spend all that money. Probably by now a majority don't want to support Israel. A huge majority, because this I study, are in favor of a less unequal United States. They would like there to be a smaller gap between rich and much smaller than there is. And on and on and on. Majority want a higher minimum wage. They don't get any of it. And they know that. And they're angry with Republicans. You didn't do what you promised. And they vote Democrat. Then they get angry at the Democrats. You didn't do what you promised. It's all true. They promised it and they didn't do it. The reality is that political independence is a shell if you don't have economic independence. Or to say the same thing domestically, political democracy is a veneer if you don't have economic democracy, and we don't. Every business in this country, with very few exceptions, every factory, every office, every store, has a tiny group of people at the top who have all the power. In a corporation or a major form of business, a corporate board of directors, typically 15 people, they decide what to produce, how to produce, what technology to use, where to do it, and what to do with the revenue. The rest of us are employees. We make none of those decisions, nor do we have any power to decide who makes them. The shareholders do that. Shareholders are not employees and vice versa. We don't have a democratic system, and therefore that pollutes or undermines the claim to democracy. So when Kamala Harris gets up there, or any of the others, and they're preserving democracy, the only thing one can do is grin. You are doing a magic trick. You are preserving something that isn't there. The first problem for the Middle East is that they don't have economic independence, nothing remotely like it. The only country with a little bit of exception to that, just a little, is Israel. Why? Because of their peculiar relationship, A, to Jews and B, to the United States, which gives them a whole lot of money for nothing, just out of a kind of solidarity. You are our baby. You are our friend. There's a load of opportunity, cash, business deals, all kinds of things that are available to them through that contact that are not available yet to the others. BRICS may equal that game. That is, BRICS become a source of that kind of support either for selected other countries in the Middle East, which is already beginning to be the case. For example, Iran which is why for Israel this is such a problem. Iran has, by being a BRICS member now, but also by dint of a very carefully followed policy, has now built relationships between Russia, its neighbor, and China. And Iran will see if Israel and Iran now enter into a war, what kind of support Russia and China will give. My guess is it will surprise everybody, just the way the support for Russia in the Ukraine war has surprised everybody. But for the moment, the Middle East is in a terrible place because they have political independence. They do not have economic dependence, which means they're either terribly poor and dependent on very few resources, or they have oil, which means they're dependent on that. And they're dependent on a global oil system that they cannot control. They're much too small. The only one who can do that a little is Saudi Arabia, and it doesn't want to share that position. The overcoming of the fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was achieved by the Chinese, that changes the equation because that gives it the chance for a unity across what was a very divisive thing, because that's not just the unity of two major countries, and it's not just the unity of two major oil producers. It is the unity of Sunni and Shia within the Muslim. That very, very important. That the Chinese did that and that they understood all that should be an enormous message to the West. And now, to be fair, most of what Iran has done has been the consequence of American policy. I think the Iranians would have been willing to cut deals with the United States. The Americans lost the opportunity. They didn't. When Trump canceled the arrangement with Iran early in his thing, that was a terrible misjudgment, and that has been kept going. I just recently read a very nice article, very well done. You know who Zbigniew Brzezinski was? The advisor to Bush and the others. His whole thing before he died was the importance of the United States making an arrangement with Iran. And his great enemy were the neocons who wanted to destroy Iran. And that he died having lost that battle. The neocons have been in charge, and they have, and that drove Iran into where it is, as it did with Russia and China, bringing them together. Very, very, very dangerous for the United States. Now being offered a place in the BRICS, the Israelis unable or unwilling to try to find a place for themselves in the BRICS means that they're on the edge or out of it altogether. That's a whole new situation, because before, Israel was alone with a patron, the U.S. None of those countries had a comparable patron. Even if you had a patron of Russia, which they didn't, but even if you had it, Russia with a $1.5 trillion, United States with 23, what's the GDP of China? 17, 18 trillion. They are in the running, and they're getting closer every day. Russia's not. And with Russia and China together and Iran, then you have them as the patron. That's part of what this war is about. That patron is becoming important for all the smaller countries. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. They're looking and they're seeing Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia are now with Russia. They know where their future is. Right there it is, right in front of you. They're applying. They want to get in there. And the last thing is, the greatest representative of the colonial master isn't the old empires. Those have been defeated. They all got independence. It's the new one, the economic monster from which we did not get independence, which is global capitalism, which is represented, or was, by the United States. So Israel is the United States for them. Every time Mr. Biden gets up and says, we will be with Israel all along, it's one more nail in the coffin, man. It does not, you have to be blind not to understand. And that's true not just in the Middle East, but in the whole Muslim world. That goes to Indonesia, Pakistan, or any of the other major Muslim countries, not to speak of Africa, or the growth of Islam in Latin America, all of which are significant. Here's the irony. The United States, after World War II, developed a commitment to things that were either called containment or some other kind of policy to isolate Russia, the Soviet Union, or to Eastern Europe. Now to isolate, you know who's getting isolated? We are. It's the person who's busy painting everything in their environment, and then they end up in that, like in the cartoon, they've painted themselves into a corner. We're not isolating others, you stupid fuck. We're isolating us. Some great journalist, I think it was, made a crack, which has become widely well known. And it goes like this. The first casualty in every war is the truth. Wars being what they are have motivated lots of people, not just America, but all kinds of people all around the world to start telling monstrous make-believe. And again, there are many motivations. No leader of a war wants to be the loser, because that's usually the end of your career. So you got to be the winner. And no one wants to hear about the lost battles. They want to hear about the valiant achievements. And that's usually on both sides. So you really should be deeply skeptical of anything that sounds like an official assessment of something in a war, unless it is so lopsided, the war, that one side doesn't need it, don't need the public. It's not that they wouldn't do it, it's not that they haven't done it, but they don't need it. Anyway, in this case, I think you have a little bit of the propaganda on both sides, a bit more on the Ukraine than on the Russian, but that you have to treat it all with a good bit of skepticism would be strange not to. On the other hand, it's not symmetric. The gap between Russia and Ukraine is as big that way as between Russia and the United States. So you're looking at a colossus fighting a mouse, okay? So forget everything you know. The chances of the mouse winning, very slim. Everybody who pays attention knows that. Okay, the inequality is reduced when the West decides it's going to support this Ukraine. That was decided politically 10 years ago, in 2014. When the Cold War ends, all the Eastern European countries that were allied with Russia, from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, became, quote unquote, fully independent. They were no longer dependent on the Soviet Union, because one there. So all of their governments collapsed and were replaced by more or less right-wing governments. There were some exceptions, but basically it's a story. Ukraine among them. Took a little longer. Ukraine for a while had a leader who was very pro-Russian, openly so. He was overthrown. The Americans were involved in that, as they were in many of these. How important were they? Sometimes a lot, sometimes not so much. Ukraine quite a bit, but I don't think all of that is all that crucial. The big issue was, would these countries be independent? You know, like Switzerland, like Austria, sort of. Or would they be like the rest of Western Europe? And now here comes the dispute. The Russians claim, and they have good evidence, that they were promised, as part of the whole deal of all of that NATO, the anti-Russian organization of Western Europe and America, would not expand eastward. They would not try to bring in all of those countries from Poland in the north, Bulgaria in the south. And the Russians would therefore let Eastern Europe go. Now, you could ask the question, perfectly reasonable. Could the Russians have stopped it in any case? Probably not. Okay, but the promises were apparently made by a whole host of American and British diplomats, politicians from the very top. And then in the years that followed, remember we're talking about stuff that happens in the early 1990s. In the years that followed, NATO did exactly what the claim is they promised not to do. Poland became part of NATO. The Baltic states, all of them became part of NATO. So if the NATO alliance moved across those countries, that cordon from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, that's a buffer zone. That's a group of countries with populations and geography separating Russia from Western Europe. And therefore no military could come across there without the Russians having ample time and space and distance to protect themselves. And Russia has been invaded, repeatedly, right? Napoleon invaded Russia, World War I they invaded Russia, World War II Hitler invaded Russia. Worrying about invasions from Western Europe is a reasonable position for them to have. You may not like it, you may not agree with it, but given their history, wow. So they wanted that. So they're giving that up. So they lost that. And Mr. Putin First it was Yeltsin and a couple of the other clowns they had there. That Mr. Putin is sitting there trying to be the president of a country, going through unspeakable difficulty. The collapse of their system would have been difficult for everybody, but they were also trying to reconstruct an economy. Very, very difficult. So he discovers he's the president. He's doing a passable job of recrafting an economy, but he looks like a weakling. I mean, all those countries are joining NATO, and he can't do anything. He can't stop it. He complains about it. He says, you're violating. We will not let you continue doing this, but we did it, and you didn't do shit. Nothing. And Ukraine had been more integrated into Russia. The others were more, Poland is its own thing, and Romania is its own thing. If you went to the most famous restaurant in New York City serving Russian food for the last century, the Russian Tea Room, the most, if not the most famous dish, one of the two great dishes, is called chicken Kiev. It's a particular way of preparing chicken, as was originally done in the Ukrainian city capital of Kiev. The Russian Tea Room featured that because that's as Russian as it gets. For them to start saying, as they did, after they took all the other countries, we are now next going to go after Ukraine. And remember, they also tried 10 years ago to get a hold of Georgia, the state of Georgia, where Stalin came from, in the south of Russia there. So it was clear that now the Russians are stiffening. You've taken all of that, but you're not going to come in and take what were literally parts of Russia. Georgia was a republic within the USSR, as Ukraine was. In the Russian Revolution, all of these places were given the status of independent republics, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That's what USSR stands for. So they were much more integral. So now NATO is beginning to disconnect a piece of Russia from the rest of Russia. And Putin says, and he did it several times, we will not let you do that. You can't do it. They got rid of the pro-Russian government, Maidan Revolution. They had 2 or 3 people wanting to be. There was a comedian, a popular comedian in Ukraine, named Zelensky. They brought in the comedian. He was a good actor. He puts on the valiant struggler leader persona nicely. And they make announcements. They're working to bring Ukraine into NATO. And he says, okay, we're done. 2 days later, they invade. I mean, he had been building troops and moving them to the border, so people knew. The United States knew. Weeks, maybe even months, what was going to happen. But they thought it was still bluffing. All right, now he's at the next level of bluff, but he moved the troops, and then 2 days after the last time, he did it. Okay, so now what? Now the United States is caught. They have a plan in their hallucination. They're going to carve Russia up. Russia's not going to be the big colossus it used to be. A country that goes from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the North Sea. That's always been the dream. Be very easy to manipulate 20 little republics like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan and Armenia, all of which were republics before. So they want to carve it up into republics, and the more moderate ones say, no, we just want to slap Russia on the wrist. It's easy to do now. All of it was a mistake. They misunderstood the BRICS, misunderstood their own position in the world economy. They don't get it. They still don't.